In April of 1865, the Civil War effectively comes to an end at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army has grown weak in 4 years of war. Driven out of their fortified lines near Richmond, they are chased west by a vastly larger Union army. Cut off from supplies, Lee realizes that the game is up.
April 9th carries with it more than just another day in American history. It is a pivotal point in the close of hostilities on American soil that split families, divided a nation for years, and still resonates to many with a negative shadow about race and governmental influence. 150 years ago today, the American Civil War officially came to a close, but as with everything, that doesn't tell the entire story. Our guest is the award-winning Civil War historian and author of The Devil's to Pay, John Buford at Gettysburg, a history and walking tour. And one of his websites is Rantings of a Civil War Historian, bringing obscurity into focus. Let's welcome Eric Wittenberg to MidPoint. Eric, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure, Ed. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, because I wanted to get right on what we just heard on that soundbite coming in where it said the war effectively ended on April 9th. But I think that is still the one thing that people learn through history. It didn't end on April 9th. It took a long time for this war to actually come to an official close, did it not?
That's correct. 9 days after the surrender at Appomattox, General Joseph Johnston, who commanded the remaining Confederate troops in the field, met with William Tecumseh Sherman in Durham, North Carolina. They actually negotiated something that was akin to a peace treaty. That peace treaty was rejected by the United States government on the grounds that a treaty would recognize that the Confederacy was actually a foreign country, which it was not. Sherman was told that he had overstepped his authority and was ordered to abrogate that treaty, and that all he could offer Johnston was the same terms that Grant had offered Lee at Appomattox. They met again on the 26th of April, and Johnston surrendered the 3 remaining Confederate armies in the field to Sherman that day, but it took until the 2nd of June before the last Confederate troops in the field actually physically surrendered.
If we look at the different dates then, it goes all the way into May, actually, because isn't it fair to say, look, we're dealing with the Civil War. It's not as if there was instant communication from one side of a state or one side of a town to another, a county even, because wars were going on, and it took a while for messages to reach people that at least one side or one division, if you will, had surrendered.
That's absolutely correct.
With regard to that then, how did that sift through, and what was the basic reaction then of those? Because I have to imagine there are still those who said, this can't be right, we've got to still be fighting.
Well, in fact, there were Confederate units that categorically refused to surrender. Some of them broke out from the lines at Appomattox an example is some Confederate cavalry regiments that, rather than surrender, they simply disbanded. The famous partisan ranger John Singleton Mosby called his troops together and disbanded his command rather than surrender it. And it was a Confederate cavalry general in the Western Theater by the name of Joe Shelby who actually led his command into Mexico rather than surrender it.
Do we still to this day, as we look at the numbers, 750,000 American soldiers and sailors may have died, many from disease. 30 to 40,000 northern amputees, no equivalent numbers in the South at this point, but people who actually had to work into the 19th century. Do we still to this day not de-romanticize in some ways some of the Civil War and realize what an absolute brutal time in this nation's history it was, and the brutality of the war is scary sometimes when you consider it?
That is unfortunately a true statement. And one of the things that concerns me as both a lawyer and a Civil War historian is this tendency we're beginning to see of state legislatures attempting to impose nullification rules on federal legislation in violation of the Supremacy Clause of the United States Supreme Court. This is how the secession crisis began in the 1830s in South Carolina, and seemingly the lessons of history have not been learned, and as the old cliche goes, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them.
Would it be fair to say that we are still here in the year 2015, still feeling the effects of a lot of the racism of that time? And as a matter of fact, when you see people who stand by the principles of what the South and what some people in the South stood for, that flies in the face of a lot of what we're trying to accomplish today.
I would agree. And it is quite unfortunate that 150 years later, we're still having to deal with some of these same issues again and again and again.
Then what do we need to learn? You've studied the Civil War. You've been inside it, if you will. You know a lot of these things. What is it that we most need to learn about the Civil War that comes forward into our time that can make some sort of a substantive change in our society?
The biggest lesson, in my humble opinion, that we can learn from the events of 1861 to 1865 are that while we all have differences, in the end we're all Americans and we need to stay together as Americans, rather than, to borrow a line from Ben Franklin and mix my metaphors just a little bit, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
When the Civil War ended, how long, in your estimation, did it take really for people in the South, people in the North, to lose a lot of the aggression, to finally bring themselves back together again? Because the healing process took decades. It still is going on to today, but how long did it take?
Really, it was the oncoming of the Spanish-American War was really the biggest thing. In order to induce Southerners to want to serve in the Spanish-American War, a number of former Confederate generals actually came back into service in the United States Army in order to help that process speed along, and that's the biggest one. One of them had been a Confederate cavalry general by the name of Joseph Wheeler, who was one of the strongest advocates of the Spanish-American War as a congressman. He was went back into service, even though he was in his 60s, ended up being the only one of these former Confederate generals to command troops in the field, and actually was in command of the forces that captured what history calls San Juan Hill, actually Kettle Hill, in Cuba, and was the commander of Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. And then Wheeler ended up being placed in command of all the troops sent to the Philippines to put down an insurrection there after the Philippines came under U.S. control. And it's why Joe Wheeler is the only former Confederate that's been allowed to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
We are still dealing with it. We are still dealing with it to this day. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I do want to make a note once again. The book is The Devil's to Pay. John Buford at Gettysburg, a history and walking tour. Fascinating. We need to learn more about that time in our life. Thank you so much. Good luck with the book.
Thank you, Ed.
My pleasure. Take care. MidPoint will continue.